Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest in the series of NUITEQ Snowflake webinars. Today we have, as always, Danielle Macklin here to talk to us, and she will be going over a lesson plan template that we've developed. So part of the lesson plans, the lesson activities that we're developing that will be coming out in a couple of months for all of you include this lesson plan activity template. What we're wanting to do tonight is to share that with you so that you can use it yourself when you're developing your own lesson activities and add it into your lesson activity so that it gives you a little bit more meat and actually would give you your lesson plan for the day. So I'm going to get off camera, turn it over to Danielle, and we'll go from there. Have a great evening. Hey, actually, any questions, please put them in the questions tab and we will get right to them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jack. So hi, everyone. As Jack was saying, we are going to talk a little bit about our Snowflake lesson activity template that we are using when we design our new lesson activities. So I'm going to share that with you. So I have this open just as a Google Doc. When we create our lesson activities, we all use a copy of this as kind of our driving force behind designing the activities themselves. So with some of the newer lesson activities that will be published shortly, you'll see that all of them will include this full lesson plan. So we have our lesson title, and I'm going to show you our blank version just with kind of the directive information in it, and then I'll show you examples of lesson activities that have been created using this lesson plan template. So all of our new lesson activities will correspond to particular grade levels, as well as standards. Right now, we're in the process of designing lesson activities that align to math and ELA Common Core standards, as well as the Next Gen Science standards. All of our lessons will also have an objective. So this would be your students will be able to. So what skills are they going to be able to demonstrate? What tasks can they accomplish? What content will they be able to learn? In our lesson plan template, we have a section on prior knowledge. Our prior knowledge is telling what needs to be learned prior to the lesson. So this will include kind of the scope and sequence of how the lesson is going to be designed. So what do students need to have a full grasp on prior to completing the lesson activity, the Snowflake lesson activity? Or what other resources have they been introduced to, or what other lesson activities on Snowflake can link into this section of prior knowledge to prepare students for the lesson itself. And then we have our section on new information. So this is the concepts that are being taught. We will write, as we're doing this, we have a brief description of what students are going to be learning. Typically, this is done in kind of a bullet point fashion. And it's also kind of the sources where teachers can access the work of the lesson and the video presenting the lesson content. And then we get into the procedural step-by-step how to use the lesson activity. So all of our lesson activities we are building using the Universal Design for Learning principles, and we are including instructions on how can you use this lesson activity as part of a whole group instruction, either in-person in your classroom using your interactive panel, or if you're doing this remotely and you're delivering in-person virtually instruction to your students through one of your learning platforms, if it's through like your Google Classroom, or if you're doing like a Google Meet or Zoom, or however you're meeting with your classes. And then we also have for independent practice and assessment. So if the lesson activity is designed to be done individually by the student, or perhaps in a small group, or perhaps as part of that asynchronous learning that they would be doing on their own, we have instructions of how to use that same lesson activity in that format. So we really try to make sure that with our instructions for how to play the lesson activity, we're giving a variety of how it can be used. So hopefully it is making your life a little bit easier, and here's the lesson activity itself, and then here's excuse me, the instructions of how to use it in a variety of different formats. So whatever best meets your needs. We also include instructions on how the lesson has been differentiated. So we have examples of how to scaffold the lesson. So if you're having students who are maybe not at grade level or who need those extra supports or extra modifications or accommodations, the scaffolding provides the instructions of how to use that lesson activity with those scaffolds in place, as well as how to use the lesson activity as part of an accelerated model. So your students who are above grade level, or who maybe are your students who are part of your gifted and talented, or just who have very quickly and easily understood the concept and you want to advance it to the next level, the accelerated model would provide instructions for that. Our lesson plan template also has information on the content vocabulary. So any vocabulary that is relevant to the lesson activity itself, so anything students need to know prior or to know during the lesson activity, would appear in this section. And then in the material list, it's very obviously the materials you would need for the lesson itself. So many times this will include attachments to PDFs or worksheets that students can use. It would also include materials that might be hands-on manipulatives that students could be using in class, or additional paper copies of things that you would send home with your kiddos if they're doing remote instruction. And then in many of them, it's a very simple, like pens and papers and all of the other supplies that you would need to deliver the instruction itself. So everything would be listed under materials. And then the last two pieces we have are the follow-up activities. So the follow-up activities are, once the students have met the standard, these would be your additional resources and worksheets. This could also be lesson activities that relate to the lesson that you've instructed. So for example, if I was doing a lesson activity on using verbs, I might have additional Snowflake lesson activities that are related to that linked in this section. So kind of a way to branch out and build upon your lesson activity. And then the last piece is just any additional information. So if there's any just extra reminder or other things to consider when delivering the instruction or using the materials or using the lesson itself or any of the supplemental resources, all of that extra stuff would be added here. So we really try to, as we've been building our new lesson activities, we really try to make sure that they are very robust, that they are rigorous, and that they are all driven around the standards and the objectives that students would be able to do.
Danielle?
Yes.
We have a question.
Sure.
How would I get access to this template?
Okay. So this particular one, I've opened it just in my Google Doc because that's what I use to edit. But I do have a blank one that we have shared on CyberDuck. I can share that link in just a moment, and I'll put that in the chat. So let me go ahead and just...
Yet, I think instead of just sitting in the chat, anyone that's interested in having it, just email me at jr@nuitec.com.
Perfect. That makes it a lot easier for me. I had it ready, but that's definitely a big time saver. All right, so I'm going to go back and continue sharing. So we talked a little bit about how the lesson template looks when we're building our lessons. I'm going to show you how we've actually built lessons using it. So if I'm going over to snowflake.live, make sure I'm sharing the right screen. All right, so I have two examples of lesson activities that have been built using the lesson plan template. I have a high school level one and then an elementary level. So I'll start with the high school, and I'm going to do it just by playing, and then I'll go through the edit portion. So this lesson activity is using open education resources from OpenStax. OpenStax features a lot of really great higher level textbooks, and the entire textbook can be downloaded as a PDF, or you can go through and read online specific segments of the textbook. So in this case, this particular lesson involved chapter 13 from OpenStax, and the link to that is provided as well. So we can see the link is here. and then the additional resources that relate to it. Also have the links here. So as this lesson is played, this is just a simple quiz. Students would read the chapter and then answer the questions on the quiz. There are 10 questions for it. So with that particular lesson itself, the lesson plan that relates to it, pull up my PDF. So from an educator perspective, being able to find that lesson activity and then now seeing the full lesson plan that relates to it would make the lives of teachers, our goals, to make it a lot easier and provide you with everything that you would need. So we can see this lesson activity is designed for grade levels 9 through 10. It is linked to 2 separate Common Core standards. The objective of the lesson itself is students would be able to explain the concept of judicial activism versus judicial restraint. Students will examine Supreme Court cases related to the concepts, evaluate the decision, and formulate arguments in support or refutation. So that's what students will be able to accomplish by the time they have finished the lesson activity. Under prior knowledge, it has the information that students would need to know before the lesson activity itself. So if you were using the textbook, it would be typically the chapter before or any other information that relates to this. This would probably be done in a high school social studies class, civics class. So the prior knowledge, students would be able to have been exposed to the previous question, what is the role of the judicial branch in the American legal system? They would need to be able to answer the following questions. A really good way, just from a pedagogy perspective, of introducing that to your students, this would be a great bell ringer or your first task as students have entered the class, or to introduce the lesson itself, just to gauge students' understanding, making sure they understand how the Supreme Court determines the constitutionality of a law and why might it be important for the Supreme Court to hold the power of deciding if a law is unconstitutional. So these kind of discussion questions could be used to gauge student understanding before going into it. And it would give you as an educator a chance to figure out if there's anything that needed to be retaught to your students. The new information goes through and talks about the concepts that students will learn: judicial activism, judicial restraint, how they're related, and Supreme Court cases related to that. And then as we go through, we can see how this lesson plan has been set up for students to use the lesson activity as part of a broader instructional plan. So students will have already been exposed to and completed lesson activities on the judicial branch of government, powers of the Supreme Court. They would use the textbook from OpenStax, chapter 13. They would be assigned the reading prior to instruction and take notes via the Cornell note-taking method using the attached resource. And again, that resource would be provided right here under materials. And then as part of the how to play, we have instructions for how to use this as a whole group method. So as a whole group, students will work in pairs to read the question, determine the answer. They will cite from their notes or from the OpenStax text evidence to support their response. Teacher can divide the interactive board in zones, opening OpenStax text via the browser application. If this is being done as part of an independent practice, we see our instructions for that. This could be sent to students' individual Snowflake accounts and marked as a gradable assessment.
Danielle?
Yes.
There's a question that came in that said, how would you differentiate for online versus, in-class versus remote learning using the template?
That is a really good question. So when you say differentiate, are we talking just differentiate between the delivery of instruction? I'm hoping
that is what the question meant. Like, how would you differ the instruction using it remotely or in class?
Really good question. So I think that would really depend on how you've been delivering really any of your instruction with students. And I know that with kind of everything being a little crazy with schools going back and forth between remote and hybrid and in-person, and sometimes things switching like on a day's notice, if even that. As far as differentiating, I think with this particular lesson activity, the fact that you could do simple screen sharing, like in our webinar, we're using Livestorm. If you're using in your class Google Meet or Zoom or whatever method your district has decided to use to have that face-to-face interaction with students, you could still do the same instruction. You could still have the lesson activity opened in snowflake.live, and then in a separate tab, you could have a link to the textbook open and go through with your students together. They could also have access to that resource. You could put the link, and I think the link is, if I go to the edit portion of my lesson activity, I could provide my students with all of the PDFs and web links that they would need so that they could be doing it alongside me while I was delivering the instruction via my whatever platform, Zoom, Google Meets, whatever. So they could have access to that as well, or I could attach maybe the textbook or the reading or whatever part, I could attach that as a PDF for my students. So here you can see I have everything just as web links, so our graphic organizer, the note templates. If I share this lesson activity with my students, either sending it to my students to complete in their snowflake.live classes, or I could also save it unlisted. And then as an unlisted share, I can send the link to my students, and I could post this on our LMS. So if we're on a Google Classroom, I could post the link there, and my students would have access to the lesson activity itself. I hope that answered. Jack, if there's more you'd like to add to it, please go right ahead.
No, I think you did a good job of answering. I think also if we just even look at whole group instruction versus independent practice, that gives us a lot of information there of how we might do something either in the class or independently remotely.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's just been a big learning curve for educators in general, is trying to figure out, how do I take something that I've been doing for an in-person activity and now how do I switch it to a remote platform? I think one of the great things with using snowflake.live is the same activity that you could do on your interactive panel with the Snowflake app with your students in class, you could also do that same activity online using Snowflake Web. So you still have access to all of the lesson activities. Students can still be engaged in it. They can still play on their own. And just the style of teaching would just be a little bit different than if you were face-to-face with your kiddos. All right, so that was kind of how to do this for whole group independent practice, and then also for the scaffolded or accelerated. So scaffolded would be a lot more of teacher-led and making sure that, maybe you're reading the passages with the students while students are on their own device, or the teacher modeling how to take the notes. So that could be one scaffolding. I mean, that would be a good practice for any students if they're not familiar with how to take notes, particularly Cornell notes. And then accelerated, this is how to advance the lesson even further. So what they could do with that, as far as this one is researching a Supreme Court case decision and then using the claim evidence reason method, so the CER graphic organizer. So and those links would pull up. You can see the graphic organizers there. Students would be able to download and add that information. And then there's the link to our the online textbook that would relate to the lesson activity, the vocabulary that's relevant to the lesson activity. You can see in that first question, it was about Miranda v. Arizona. And then we have our follow-up activities. So how can you continue to extend the lesson itself? And then additional Snowflake activities. So we have one Snowflake activity, which is about freedom of speech. So since that is relevant to many Supreme Court cases. So that is an example of a secondary use of the lesson activity template. And I will go to a kindergarten one. So here we have a Three Little Pigs STEM challenge. I believe this starts with a YouTube video. I'm going to skip over that since it is just the story of the Three Little Pigs. Oh, nope, I made sure I edited that before. Good, okay. So with this particular lesson activity, here we can see there's the linked YouTube video. This could be edited back, so the video would play first. And then as we go through to the lesson plan, I can see the grade level this relates to, that this relates to the next generation science standards. The objectives for my students will be able to evaluate the strength of different building materials and design a structure that can withstand force. So that's being related to students being able to analyze data from tests of two objects designed to solve the same problem. So in this case, it is the students are building structures for their little piggies that would be safe from the big bad wolf should the big bad wolf come and try and blow their house down. So using that story of the three little pigs to start the lesson, and then using kind of STEM elements incorporated so that students would design a structure. So here we have our new information. So students will use the story of the three little pigs to evaluate different building materials, straw, sticks, and bricks, and they will design and build a structure that can withstand force, in this case, wind. So for this particular lesson activity, this has a lot of steps on how to use the lesson activity for whole group instruction. This would be done obviously for in-person whole group instruction, where students would be working in groups to build their structures. And then if you were to scaffold this for a remote model, it would be similar ideas, but then sending students home with maybe some of the materials that they would need. Instead of having those materials in your class, you would send that home. However your district is managing sending things home to kiddos, that could be done there. Or having students using found objects at home. So in this case, they're building their structures, and then they go through what is being called the huff and puff test. So that would be using a fan or a hair dryer, something that would blow wind. Nothing too strong. Probably wouldn't want like a leaf blower. I don't think that could hold up for very much. But students are essentially designing little structures, and then the big bad wolf is trying to blow those structures down. And this is giving students an opportunity to design and to test and to make changes so that they really understand that scientific method and have the incorporation of a STEM lesson activity. So there we have that. If this is being done for independent practice, so all of the attached worksheets can be downloaded and added as a PDF to the lesson activity or as a list. Students could also complete the lesson activity on their own device as part of remote instruction or during a station rotation. And as I'll show when we go back to do the lesson itself, what that would look like. And then we have our instructions of how to use this lesson activity for scaffolded or accelerated students. We have our content vocabulary, our materials. So here we have the link to the YouTube video from Socratica Kids. We have the accompanying worksheet. So this attached PDF of the three little pigs. So this would give students a chance to, since it is for kindergartens, this would be a chance to practice their number writing and recognition. We have short little stories, and they would be able to trace and practice their letters. So we have first little pig, the second little pig with his house of sticks, and the third little pig with their house of bricks. And then what the big bad wolf was able to do. So we have, and then the instructions that students would be able to do of what would happen, or what happened to their house if they built a straw house. What happened to their house when the big bad wolf huffed and puffed on their stick house. And then again, what happened with the brick house. Students also have the a planning template of how they would use materials to build a strong house. They would plan out what it would look like. And then all of those pieces relate back to the lesson activity, where students would go through the different rounds. So if you're doing this for in-person instruction, this could be displayed on your interactive panel. And you would be able to read the questions to the students as you go through the story of the three little pigs. And then the task of building. So you can build a house using the straw materials. What happened during the huff and puff test. So these would be really great discussion questions that students would be able to use while they're doing their experiment. And then same for building for a stick house, building for the brick house, and then designing their own really strong house. So what materials would they use? What would happen during the first huff and puff test? What do you need to change to make your house stronger? And what happens during the second test? So students are using that scientific method. They're incorporating STEM, and they're having those next gen science standards related to it as well. And all of that goes back to our lesson plan template. So where we have all the instructions and then any additional activities. So in this case, there's an additional STEM activity that's found in the Snowflake community titled Building a Bridge. And under additional information, this lesson activity has the ability to be edited to include additional text in the card tiles. So as we can see in the cards itself, I can go and take this lesson from the community, and then I can edit to make changes. So I might want to change the text a little bit or move things around. I have that ability where I can change all of that. I also could change my instructions within the description. If I were sending this to my students remotely, I can incorporate any of my web links, PDFs, the same thing that we had before, and I can change up the video. So maybe I have my own video of the three little pigs that I want to include. I could add that in as well. This also has under additional information kind of those things that might not be related to the lesson activity itself, but related to the pedagogy behind using that lesson activity. In this case, reviewing with students class policy and expectations regarding sharing, taking turns, especially when using any materials in class. That's something, and working collaboratively. Those are often skills that our littles continuously need to be taught as well. So those are just two examples of lesson activities in the Snowflake community that are using the Snowflake lesson activity lesson plan template. At this point, I'd like to take some time and answer any questions that have come in. I'm hearing a couple dings, so I'm hoping there's some questions coming.
Questions? I think we're okay. We were just catching up on something else. Sorry.
No problem.
I did want to ask you a question just from my perspective of how others might work with it. If you were a teacher in your district, how would you take what we're providing as this framework and use it within your classroom? Would that be something that would be useful to you? And what would it help you save time with as a teacher?
Are you posing that question to me or to our participants?
You.
Okay. Well, I think, I mean, obviously I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I think in general, just having the resources where I'm given that inspiration, where even if I don't follow it step by step exactly as it's saying, I at least have an idea of how to use one of the lesson templates in a way that maybe I haven't thought of before. This is also really great too, as far as being able to keep record of what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching, so that from year to year, I could just print off that lesson plan and I could add my notes. I could add any edits that I needed to do, but I'd already have it set up for me. So really, it's just the matter of being able to save time that I might otherwise would have to spend designing an entire instruction based off of one or two particular standards. So, and I'm hoping that's what we're doing too, as we're building these lesson activities using that lesson plan, is we're really trying to give teachers a robust lesson so that the lesson activity is just one piece of a full and rigorous lesson that could be delivered in class. So if you're a math teacher and we're using one Snowflake lesson activity, it's also going to include other materials that you can use to continue to deliver instruction and meet your standards.
Great. Actually, that's what I was going to transition to. So thank you for that. I think one of the great things that we are trying to do for all the teachers is provide this type of framework so that when they search for a standard that they're teaching, up pops the lesson activity template like you've just gone over and shown, with all these additional resources that are there. And it would save teachers tons of time not having to go out and search on the internet to see all these other things that they could bring in. And they can, if they wanted to tweak it, could take it and just tweak it a little to whatever they need for their classroom, or for differentiation on even more levels for different ELL or special education or 504 or whatever it is. The tweaking that needs to be done could be done very quickly using the framework that we've given. And so I'm hoping that we're providing things that are going to be very useful to teachers, that will save them time and make their jobs a lot easier. And we're keeping in mind with it being both in class and remote, because it seems like this might be going back and forth for a while. And so we just want to make sure that we're helping people out in that situation. So if no other questions come in, I will say thank you, Danielle. We're ending a little bit early, but we would rather give you your time back than to just be online. So thank you for attending. Danielle, thank you again for putting together a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing everybody again next week. So if you have any other questions in the meantime, please feel free to email. And again, if you have any question, or if you would like a copy of the lesson activity template that Danielle presented, please email me at jr@nuitec.com. Thank you, and everybody have a great week. Bye-bye.
Everyone, thank you.